Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directed his military to prepare to evacuate an estimated 1.3 million people in the city of Rafah. And this comes ahead of a looming ground offensive in Gaza's southern border city of Rafah. To talk more on the situation, we are now being joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics, Clinton Institute, University College of Dublin. Thanks very much for taking our time and joining us here on WION, Professor Lucas.
Thank you for having me here.
Now, Professor, according to UNRWA, there are 1.4 million displaced people in Gaza. The IDF has now asked them to evacuate the area. But talk to us about the options that are on the table for the Palestinians. The pertinent question that everyone is asking right now is that where can they go from Rafah?
The displaced in Rafah, indeed the residents of Rafah, so more than 1.3 million people out of Gaza's 2.3 million population have nowhere to go. I emphasize, they have nowhere to go. Every other part of Gaza has been attacked, has been devastated since October 7th. They can move back into those devastated areas, but they may be attacked again. The option that is being held out for them by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is go to Egypt.
Right.
But many of the Palestinians don't want to leave their homeland. They don't want to leave their country. They don't want to leave the places where they grew up, raised children, where they continue to live despite the threat of attacks. And even if they wanted to leave, Egypt does not want permanent refugees in its country, and Arab countries don't want a repetition of the Great Displacement, the Nakba of 1948, after the creation of Israel, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were moved into other countries at that point, never to return to their homes.
Right. Professor Lucas, just to add to that point where you mentioned that Netanyahu is asking the displaced Palestinians to go to Egypt, but Egypt has warned that any movement of Palestinians into Egypt would threaten the 4-decade-old peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. So clearly, like you mentioned, that there is no place for Palestinians to go to right now. On top of that, aid agencies have warned that large number of civilians could die in the offensive. Talk to us more about the humanitarian repercussions and the humanitarian cost of Israel's offensive in Rafah.
Not just Israel's offensive on Rafah, but of course, the attack since October 7th, which we must emphasize followed Hamas's own mass killings inside Israel. But we are talking about a death toll of up to 30,000 Gazans who have now been killed. Thousands more are missing and are probably dead. Of an estimated up to 1.9 million people who have been displaced. So that's 85% of Gaza's population. They're in overcrowded shelters. Many of them do not have access to clean water. They don't have access to regular supplies of food. They don't have decent sanitation. They don't have hospitals that function now because Israel has bombed most of them. They can't move about to get to a safe area because roads have been destroyed. In other words, the UN just simply says humanitarian crisis. I cannot describe to you in just a few minutes the scale of that humanitarian crisis. This is an entire population who has been put on the verge of extinction because, again, whatever is in Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind, what is ever in the minds of the other war cabinet, they don't care about the civilian population. They do not care about the civilian population. You may also argue, and I think it's a valid argument, that Hamas does not care about Gaza's civilians and has in effect used them as human shields. But the outcome is the same, that Israel is not pulling back on its attacks. There's no possible ceasefire, despite the chatter that we've had in recent weeks. We only have the prospect of endless, or at least open-ended death and destruction for weeks and who knows months, where you almost are, I'm going to use a horrible phrase, and I apologize in advance. Back in the American South where I grew up, we call it shooting fish in a barrel. That's what Israel is doing to innocent people in Gaza.
Right, Professor Lucas, let's also talk about Israel's assertion right now. Well, it has clearly lamented that they will not be able to achieve complete victory until the Hamas headquarters in Rafah are completely eliminated. And that's one of the major reasons as to why they are moving forward with the offensive in Rafah.
Well, first, let's remind people that Israel initially said after October 7th, okay, we're going to attack northern Gaza.
Right.
So you move to the center, you move to the south.
Right.
Then they say you move to the center of Gaza, you move to the south. Then as they attacked Han Yunis in the south, they said you move to Rafah. So why do they now attack Rafah? And again, I'll be very honest with you, because this is a serious situation. It is because Benjamin Netanyahu is desperate. The day that these attacks stop, if Hamas is not, in his words, quote, destroyed, Netanyahu probably does not have a political future. He is likely to be removed in elections that will be called very quickly. And he does not have a legal future, possibly, because the day that these attacks stop, he probably will be in an Israeli court facing bribery charges. So when you have all this talk of ceasefire, Netanyahu is actually being very honest. He's not lying when he says, no, absolute victory. But here's his problem. After 4 months of attacks, there's no prospect of Hamas being absolutely defeated. There are Hamas people who have moved back into the areas that have already been attacked by Israel. They are back in northern Gaza. It has not been cleared of all Gaza Hamas fighters. And they, although many of them may be killed in Rafah, Hamas is not going to disappear entirely. Because the more you attack Gaza, the more likely you are that those people who are still alive, especially young men who are still alive, they're not going to turn away from Hamas. They're more likely to join it. And that's Netanyahu's problem. But in his desperation, well, he's just simply going to push on and on and on until someone, whether from within Israel or from within the international community, makes him stop.
Right, Professor Lucas, my last question to you. While Netanyahu is moving forward with its ground offensive in Gaza, the international community, including the US and Germany, they both, and both these countries are close allies of Israel. They both have publicly opposed IDF's offensive, but Netanyahu is still adamant on going forward. Do you think that the growing international concern regarding the ground offensive in Rafah, would that deter Netanyahu from going forward?
I think the United States is probably the one country that has leverage, if not over Netanyahu, has leverage over the Israeli establishment. The U.S. could have, for example, supported a ceasefire in the United Nations. Perhaps more importantly, the United States could announce today that they are cutting military assistance to Israel if the attacks continue. And Israel gets a lot of military assistance, indeed has gotten a lot of bombs, a lot of anti-tank shells since October 7th from the United States. So I think the United States is the power with leverage. But again, to be honest with your listeners, I think too often we point to the United States and say, well, they have to do something.
Right.
Even if India doesn't have leverage over Israel directly, even if my country, the UK, has limited leverage, even if other countries in Europe and Asia can't force Israel to stop, it's not just a question of saying, we don't like this. There needs to be a forceful, day-to-day condemnation of what is occurring, not because these countries support Hamas, they don't, but because no one should support the mass killing of innocent civilians on this scale. And so I do hope that it's not just a question of leverage over Netanyahu, that it is a question of protesting and condemnation day upon day, or hour upon hour, because this is a war crime unrolling before our eyes with no prospect of stopping.
Right, Professor Lucas, thanks very much for taking our time and joining us here on WION. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks to you and your viewers.